When I reflect and look at my time as a director of education and senior leader, I think what I would want to be known for and what gave me the greatest joy was really working with other colleagues and providing that mentorship, coaching, supportive role, trying to bring out the best of people and working together as a team. And I don't know, maybe it's insecurity when I think I don't have all the answers. I don't even have a fraction of the right answer, but really drawing on the experience and expertise of everyone that I worked with. And that sense of team and team accomplishment would be a career highlight for me.
I first met Laura Elliott when she was the director of Thames Valley School Board, which is in the London, Ontario area. And even at that time, I worked quite a bit with some of the superintendents and those folks that was sort of served underneath her. But anytime I had a conversation with Laura or she was mentioned, there was just an admiration for her as this very compassionate, caring leader. And as I've got to know her more in the last few months, that remains evident. And even in that clip you just heard, her attention to her own and self-awareness around being curious and also just humility. I don't know everything. That is a very powerful and maybe even rare quality in people that are leading the kinds of organizations that Laura's leading. It's very easy just to position yourself as somebody that's authoritative. And at the same time, I know Laura has had to make many tough decisions in her career, and she's done that with grace and style as well. So what a treat it was to catch up with Laura and talk, first of all, about her new role as executive director of CODE, which is the Council of Ontario Directors, leading all of the CEOs in our largest province, but also reflecting on her time as a leader in various capacities in Thames Valley. So a joy and a privilege to chat with Laura, and I know you're going to enjoy our conversation as well. So Laura, I am in a research project right now of retirement. Not that I'm planning to retire anytime soon, but it is, you can look at me and say like, is that guy retired?
Mm.
I get that question, right? So let me ask you from that perspective, what was your thought process prior to saying I'm finishing up as a director and thinking ahead to what might happen next? Did you have a specific plan about what would happen next? Or like, how did you sort of transition from being a director in Thames Valley to where you are now?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And I think people, before they actually hit the send button and send the letter off to say, I'm going to retire, I think you really need to at least think about what it might look like. Have it in your mind. What are your days looking like? And just before I knew I wanted to retire on the specific date, I was 6 years as a director and I had completed, I think around 36 or 7 years in education. I thought at some point, there comes a time where you just say, all right, it's time for someone else to take on the role. So just before, probably 4 months before the end of August, when I did retire in 2019, I was approached by a colleague who asked if I would want to participate in one of our school college work initiative projects. And there were a few retired directors and superintendents that were part of that. I knew about the initiative. I had worked with the initiative from a program perspective in the superintendency role. And I thought, sure, this would be fantastic. This is something that I'd like to do. And it was a little bit of part-time work. And at the same time, I was also on the board of governors, and I'm still on the board of governors for Ontario Tech University, and making that volunteer contribution. And I think volunteering and paying back is extremely important as a retired educator. We've lived a beautiful life. I've had an amazing career, lots of mentors, and I think it's just an opportunity to give back from a volunteer perspective. So it's a little bit of contract work that I started with, and then of course moved into this role 2.5 years ago.
Yeah, I think that I love that you say that, just because I think I often wonder, there's days, right, where there's days where I feel like I'm out of it. Like when you have a young adult children who remind you that you're out of the zeitgeist of popular culture, you feel like you're outdated, even sometimes in education. And yet there's so oftentimes you share something that you just assume is common knowledge and or everyone understands. And a younger person will say, wow, and then you realize, oh yeah, I still have a lot to offer in terms of the experiences that I've been through and what I know. So I don't know if that's part of I think that's just a big part of the giving back. Like there's so much knowledge that you've experienced over time that it would be a waste if you weren't.
Yeah, I think sometimes in senior leadership, we don't give ourselves enough credit for the skills and the experiences that we've had in education. You see yourself in a certain niche and you don't think beyond that. But I've had many colleagues who have moved into either private business, leading completely different organizations, perhaps moving to the college or university sector because they've had some graduate degrees. So I think you really need to look at your own skill set and say, yeah, I've got lots to offer. And I continue to this day, and I have a mentorship meeting with a colleague who wants to take the next leadership step tomorrow morning. So I do a lot of
Mm.
informal mentoring with current colleagues and certainly very young people who are looking to advance their career in whatever industry.
Yeah. Well, and so much of it is this sort of tacit knowledge, like you're dealing with these very complex issues, at a school board level, and you react and you handle them, and then you're on to the next one, and you often don't have time to reflect on, gee, I actually handled that pretty well, or even if you didn't, you just say like, oh yeah, I think next time I would do it this differently. But because you're on to the next one, next one, next one all the time, quite often we just don't give ourselves time to pause. So have you like as you're sitting here now, and this leads me to my another question, but I just wanted to ask, like, do you spend a lot more time now sort of reflecting because perhaps you have a little bit more, you're not quite as fast paced as you were when you were a director. Do you have a little more time to reflect and you think back about those experiences and kind of how you responded and what you learned in that journey?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think some of the experiences that I have had over the last couple of years as a retiree, for example, being on the board of governors for both a university as well as a college, Fanshawe College in London, has really made me think about the whole area of governance and leadership. And now I'm on a board of governors. So I'm not the CEO. And I really watch the CEOs and how they work with the board, how I work with colleagues on a board. And I think a lot of the contributions that I can bring to a volunteer board of governors, especially when you're looking at the HR issues, they are numerous, as you talked about. They are
Mm.
fast and furious. Working with, I always took it for granted, I guess, that everyone works with unions until I'm working with other governors who have not had that union experience and working with unions in very senior roles in private industry. So yes, lots of time to reflect and to think about if I were in this role now, I'd really want to do things differently based on
Mm.
what I've learned in these other roles and positions.
Right. Well, that's awesome. Yeah. So now, so the question I want to ask you now is, okay, so at the Hall of Fame ceremonies for whatever particular sport or one you have, they play a highlight reel of the person's career and all the things. When you think about the highlight reel for yourself of accomplishments and things that sort of stand out as being like, over those 35, 36 years, these are the highlights that I would want on that highlight reel. What would they be in terms of, and I mean, it could be, certain successes that you've had. It could be things you participate in, but like, what would be like one or two things that just pop into your mind as being like, those were the highlights of my career in education?
Well, I think I spent a lot of time in senior leadership. I was very fortunate to be promoted to a superintendent role or senior leadership role in Ontario when I was in my late 30s. And yeah, it was really hard at the time. When I reflect and look at my time as a director of education and senior leader, I think what I would want to be known for and what gave me the greatest joy was really working with other colleagues and providing that mentorship, coaching, supportive role, trying to bring out the best of people and working together as a team. And I don't know, maybe it's insecurity when I think I don't have all the answers. I don't even have a fraction of the right answer, but really drawing on the experience and expertise of everyone that I worked with. And that sense of team and team accomplishment would be a career highlight for me in whatever work that I'm doing.
Yeah, I think when I think that that's the real, I think, biggest difference. So when I even left the classroom to work at central office, just because you had more opportunity to work with colleagues when you were a classroom teacher. It's an isolated profession, and yes, there are people around you, and good schools, figure out ways to make that support real, but it's not the same as when you're in those senior leaderships. Like, you've got somebody that you're talking with every day and trying to collaborate. So I think that's definitely a joy of that position, is being able to support one another and work more closely with one another. So yeah, I've always definitely appreciated that. Now, you've transitioned into this new role as executive director for code. So maybe, like, I'm curious to know, because I know every province and probably every state, I don't know about all, have some sort of an organization that supports these, CEOs, superintendents in most places, but in Toronto, in Manitoba, and in Saskatchewan and Ontario, we refer to the top leader in the division as the director. So when you think about this organization, like, what's sort of the mandate of it, and what do you kind of see as, I guess, your early successes in this role supporting directors in Ontario?
I think, first of all, I have to give Kelly the credit. He was the one who initiated the Council of Ontario Directors of Education. So when I refer to code, that's what I'm talking about. And he started this organization, I think it must have been in the late 1990s. And he was a director of education, visionary. He moved into this role, started code, and he worked really hard to provide the professional support to director colleagues. We have 72 school districts in Ontario. And as you had talked about, the isolation. Well, there is an isolation being the CEO and the director of education for a school board. So bringing those voices together and the professional support. So there's the whole professionalism piece. But what I think how it's evolved over the years is, and what I see most prevalent right now would be the advocacy piece, and making sure with our directors of education, just making sure that we are the voice of education within Ontario. Yes, we work very closely with the government, with our Ministry of Education, in particular our deputy minister and our assistant deputy ministers. So we want to be the go-to for policy and program decisions and looking at the future of education. And it's a
Hmm.
tough role. And that's where we're really putting a lot of energy and effort. So not being reactive to what the vision and where the education is going in Ontario, but we want to be on the front end and being on the proactive piece and helping our ministry shape the vision of education in Ontario. So when we look at code, we have the 72 districts, and we have French public, French Catholic, English public, and English Catholic. So at times it's like herding cats because we all have our own
Sure.
districts and they are all very unique, all publicly funded, and bringing all of those voices together and the extraordinary talent of our directors of education in helping to shape that vision of education for our Ontario schools.
I mean, describing that, like, you can imagine you've got 72, I don't want to say alphas, but probably alphas, like, right? Like, these are high performing individuals. And, it reminds me again of the sports analogy of the all-star team or the Olympic team, where you're bringing everybody who's like the number one together. And at some point there has to be some conciliation to work as a unit. So what are the challenges around making sure, because part of it is, I assume, that you want code to have one voice, even though there's 72 people. When you're working with a ministry, you want to make sure that there's a singular kind of mission and purpose to your communication in that sense. So what are the any I just wonder if there's any sort of challenges in kind of, like you said, herding cats, but talk more specifically about what those challenges look like to get to that kind of singular voice.
That's a really good question, and I think that's my greatest challenge as well. Is because we want to speak with one voice, but we also want to make sure, because of our 72 school districts, and all of our directors report to a board, to make sure that there are some common pieces to the vision and to the advocacy work. And so it is having those touch points. We work virtually. We closed our code office just after COVID because during COVID it was not being used. So we're a very small but mighty team of one with two exec assistants. So working virtually brings on lots of challenges too. Our province is huge. So we
Yeah.
come together physically in person twice a year. And once next week is our time event, we're coming together. And so using the technology, which I think has been one of the most positive outcomes of COVID, and ensuring that whatever we put out in the way of a public communication, that it reflects our four distinct publicly funded school systems. Because there's nothing that more, I think, than the government would want to have the divide and conquer, and trying to figure out, do these people actually have their act together? Do they speak in one voice? And it's really always communicating and getting their advice and feedback. So I'm always out there asking for advice,
Mm.
for representatives to various groups, just to make sure that we get the real life stories and the programs and what's happening on the ground, because I'm not in the school district. They are, and their voices are incredibly important because they're living it day in and day out.
Yeah, no, I mean, and listen, Ontario has a very, very strong reputation as an education entity that, like everything else, is always tenuous, and it doesn't necessarily have to be that positive. And like there's lots of things that we've seen in the news lately that's trying to suggest otherwise. So you're battling that, and but again, that challenge of creating that unified voice to say that, listen, yes, we have nuanced differences, but when it comes to, students, when it comes to advocating for the best for education, we have a priority, and we see that. So I think, again, I can imagine the challenge that you face with that. And so, but going back to kind of this idea of, mentorship and so forth, like I really do. I don't know if you sense that now or did at some point, but I think there's a crisis of leadership in education, in that we aren't seeing quite as many people step up to say this is, because it's a hard job and it's become more difficult. And so there's lots of reasons why, for sure. But like, if you identified a young person in a school, a 25-year-old who you either identified as that this person actually would make a very good leader, or comes to you and says, like, I'm curious about this. Like, what advice do you give them to say, how do you make a career in educational leadership?
Really good question. And as you said, I think that we do have a leadership crisis. When you look at teachers who are thinking of moving into school administration, and then our vice principals and principals who are thinking of senior leadership, they're looking at how they can make a difference. And I think at the end of the day, we all want the very best for our students. So we're all very student focused. We want to make sure we have the best possible programs and opportunities for our students. So I think that bodes well. What I found, at least in Ontario, there are a couple of things happening just around the political piece. Education is very political, and it is, especially for a senior
And
leader.
I think that's increasing, right? I don't know that it used to
Ah,
be as political as it has been, but that's almost a new thing, right? Maybe when you first started, that wasn't a big thing that you thought about. I don't
I
know.
don't think when I started as a classroom teacher, and certainly when you go into school administration, and as I said, I've been in senior leadership for a long time. Maybe I just didn't pay attention to the politics, especially in this role. A lot
Mhm.
of my role in as the ED of code is trying to navigate the politics and making sure that you have a voice, but that you don't burn your bridges, and you make sure that it's thoughtful respectful, professional, and there can be differences of opinion. We know at the end of the day, there are some decisions that we can for sure impact, but there are other decisions at some point you just have to say, that's something that we will not be able to manage. You make a difference where you can. But maybe if
Yeah.
I go back to your advice to the 25-year-old, I think it's really important, especially when I look at education and those who are classroom teachers and thinking about the next leadership step, that your learning journey never ends. And I think this is true for anyone, whether or not it's in the business world or certainly in education. You need to be curious. You need to always look at the formal and informal ways that you can learn, whether or not it's mentoring and learning from another colleague, as it may be informal or formal, taking additional courses, looking at either master's degrees. I know that colleges and universities are offering a lot of what they call post-grad certificates or micro-credentials. Never stop your learning. And I think I would say educators are pretty good about that. You're
Yeah.
in the business of education, and
That's
so
right.
you need to be a lead learner yourself. But I think something that might be missing with some of our leaders is you need to really pay attention to what's happening in the world, what's happening within your own province from a political standpoint, because that will significantly impact the work that you're doing as, in particular, a senior leader. So you look at the example of the Hamas-Israel situation. We've had many political protests. We've had calls for our directors to take a stance one way or another. And I think you need to be fairly well versed and understand your community. Know your community, get out there. Even if you have a little bit of time to volunteer, hands on, really know who's in your community and who the influences are, because you'll need to work with them and you need to hear and to pay attention to the disparate voices as well, because at some point you're going to have to make a decision and you're going to be scrutinized for whatever decision you make.
Well, yeah, and it to your point, it reminds me I was in Ottawa earlier in the year with Pina Buffoni from Ottawa Carleton. And Pino and I went to visit a school in inner city Ottawa, and I talked to the principal, and we were outside, and he was just sharing the fact that dealing with kids in a K-6 school around the Israel-Hamas conflict was not something that was on his bingo card about things that he thought he would have to deal with as a principal. And so, to your point, understanding the world around you and what people are feeling and thinking, and being able to be, and I think what you said about being curious, I'm sort of all in on that, because that curiosity, even with a conflict like that, right? Yes, there are people who have very strong beliefs on either side of that. And I'm not suggesting that that's bad to have a strong belief, but I think as a leader, more than having a belief in something, it's the curiosity about, oh, why might people be thinking about this on this aspect of it? Why are people thinking differently about it? I want to know, not because I have to now I have to choose a side, right? Like, cause that's part of our societies. You got to pick a team. You're either on and it's like, sometimes we don't have to pick a team, and it's not even because we are trying to be politically correct, or it's because I'm trying to understand this. And I have people in my community who are on both sides of this, and they have to come in the same building together and work. And that part of school is such like people don't recognize the fact that we have these people from these super diverse communities and beliefs. And that is both a strength, but a big challenge as well. And so, without having a curiosity to say, hey, I'd like to learn more about that, or I don't understand that. And again, not feeling like you have to, that is a signal that I have to commit to one particular side of it. I just want to learn more, right? And again, what a powerful model as an educator, helping kids to think about the value of learning, because I want to learn. I don't understand this. I want to learn.
Absolutely. And I think it's the relationships too. And I sometimes think this is another, lesson learned, that as educators, we're pretty insular. We need to really think about the parents and caregivers of all the children that we serve. We need to think about the organizations. We need to think about those families that are struggling just to have a roof
Hmm.
over their head and food on their table. That we're pretty privileged to
Absolutely.
work in education, but there are many families that are struggling. And I know our directors are thinking about those families, and they have many programs and services to support children and families. But we, I think, always need to be open to influence, not only to influence, but to be influenced, to hear
Hmm.
about a different perspective, a different point of view, and be prepared to maybe think differently in order to better support the students that you serve.
Yeah, yeah, and and in fact, I think it was an interview that I had with Krishna Burra from Limestone, where he talked about the fact that he remembers times where people considered him, especially I think it was particularly around COVID, like he was wishy-washy because he has changed something, but he said, like, "I'm gonna be the first person when I get new information that tells me I was wrong or I didn't quite have it right, I am not gonna be holding on to a viewpoint just to sort of position myself as all I'm willing to say, no, I need to change that. And I'll be the first person to say, we didn't get that right and we need to change." And that,
Absolutely.
again, that's not easy for leaders to do that because again, the perception then is, well, this person doesn't know what they're doing. They're changing their mind all the time. And it's like, well, what thinking person doesn't change their mind when they find out something they didn't know before?
Absolutely. And I think it's, again, goes back to the curiosity to keep an open mind to, I always, read a lot. I still read the newspapers, a couple every day, and I listen to the news or watch the news. So I really want to know what's going on, not only in my
Hmm.
own community, locally, but also provincially in Canada, and
Yeah.
certainly what's happening and the impact of some of these world issues that are really impacting what's happening in our schools and at our district board offices as well. We've had some very challenging times in some of our school districts over the last couple of years with advocacy groups and advocates and people who are genuinely interested in what's happening with their children's education. And the world has changed, demographics have changed, and we need to really pay attention to what other people are asking and wanting of our schools and school districts.
Well, and then it goes back to what you were talking about earlier in terms of, the way technology has been a useful tool when it comes to just your own the code organization. But it also is something that's been helpful and should be more helpful in terms of expanding our networks. As much as it's important to learn with and from others in Ontario, like we can learn with and from others across Canada and beyond. And taking advantage of that. Like that is a great privilege you have of living in 2025 is that there's nothing stopping you from connecting with people that have experienced something that you have experienced but maybe they've dealt with it differently or just a new issue that you think, well, that's coming our way. I want to get ahead of it to try to learn about something, right? So I know in the work I'm doing right now, like that's always been the great joy is that, oh, I get to hang out with people in British Columbia and find out, well, how they're doing it. And then I want to tell people like you to say, hey, you need to talk to the people in British Columbia because the thing you told me earlier, they're doing that already, or vice versa. Like you need to talk to Laura and the folks in Ontario because they've got. So I think the better we and educate we're and again, Canada struggles because we don't have a national education body. So we have to do this kind of on our own initiative to do this. But I'm seeing more and more of an appetite to want to connect and learn with others from outside of our borders and boundaries.
Absolutely. And I think that's the value of the work that you're doing now, Dean. You do a lot of travel. You work with a number of school districts and you could be that connector to bring whether or not it's learning from British Columbia to Ontario. And we take advantage. A lot of our directors are part of national and even
Yeah.
international networks. And that is critically important because we don't have all the answers. There's a lot of research that's happening in other countries and other provinces, and we often tap into the resources that they're providing and or the people. And so I think all of those international opportunities are incredibly important as well. And back to the question about the 25-year-old, travel, see the world, what's
Yeah.
happening in other schools in whether or not it's Australia or in Europe. And I had the good fortune of living in Europe just after the wall fell. Berlin Wall. So it was a very interesting time in Europe and had an outstanding opportunity to travel into it was just gave us a travel bug and that's how I
Yes.
spend some retirement days too.
Yeah, no, again, I couldn't agree more. That's been, it's a privilege, but also just such an opportunity to again come with that curiosity, not to come saying, to always compare. Everything's not a comparison about.
Mhm.
It's like no, like let's just take it for what it is and how these people live in their world, and find that fascinating, and avoid judging it either way. Just like I just want to know how people and yeah, so that's awesome. So last question before we kind of get into the little sort of I would call them more rapid fire fun questions. And I asked this question. People don't like this question because it feels like too limiting, and I get it, but I'm sorry, I'm going to put it on you. One person. I want you to think about
Mm.
one person that you are grateful for. Again, it could be somebody who influenced you early on in your career. It could be somebody late. It could be just like a random person. And again, knowing that there are hundreds of people that you could list, but maybe just somebody that just for whatever reason pops to your mind and said, I would love to give this person a shout out because of whatever, for whatever reason.
Wow, that's really hard to come up with one person, but I think in terms of my career and moving into senior administration, David Snodden, who was a superintendent of mine when I was a vice principal. And I guess he saw some leadership skills that I apparently possessed at the time. And over the next few years, unfortunately, he passed away shortly after I was promoted to the role of a superintendent. But he was the one that really, I would say, ignited my thinking about moving into senior administration. I definitely knew as a teacher I wanted to go into school administration. I really had no idea what was a superintendent, what they did, and
Hmm.
had less knowledge of what a director of education did. But he provided opportunities and mentorship, and I would say encouragement and mentoring. And I think the power of a mentor, we talk about students, the power of a caring adult, but I think someone who can follow your career path and give you those ideas and help ask really hard questions. And he was the one that did that for me, for my career. And it just, I would say, took off in terms of my time in senior administration. So, but as I said, unfortunately, he passed away shortly after I was promoted to the role of a superintendent, but eternally
Well,
grateful.
yeah. And I love that kind of idea of somebody who recognizes something in somebody else to say that, because I'm sure just even that first initial acknowledgement of your skills, whatever that was, made a difference to you. It's like, wow, somebody sees something in me. And I mean, I know exactly how you're feeling. You're not quite sure what they see in you, but just that acknowledgement, I think that just goes such a long way for people. And boy, if leaders maybe could, I would just say, I'm thinking about sort of a
Yeah.
challenge for leaders. If you can once a month identify somebody in your jurisdiction to just say, hey, not only do I appreciate what you're doing, but I think you have the potential to do something. And I think that might go a
Mm.
long way to have somebody there. So anyway, that's awesome. All right. It's been good. I'm going to give you 3 questions to sort of wrap up. What are you currently either reading or listening to more from a professional growth level? So what's on your nightstand or in your podcast list, whatever form you look at?
Well, I like cover books, real books. I'm on the screen all day long in the virtual world. So I just started the book called Who We Are by the Honorable Murray Sinclair. And it's his autobiography, and it is a fascinating read. And I always want to learn more about our Indigenous and First Nations people. And I'm a voracious reader and read Tana Talaga as well. And so that's what I'm reading right now, and it's highly
Nice.
recommended.
Well, as a highly respected First Nations leader as Murray Sinclair was, that's probably a book I should probably take on. When you're not trying to keep learning? You just want to chill, relax? I'm always curious about it. Do you have a binge watch, a show that kind of just like maybe it's something you and your husband watch, maybe it's just your own thing? I don't know. Just curious about what you might watch for more getaway stuff.
Sure. Yeah. Outside of the news. So that's the interest piece. But at the end of every day, I try and wind it down and spend an hour, maybe an hour and a half, just watching a Netflix series. I love, my one of my favorites, all-time favorites, was Yellowstone. Just finished that one.
Hmm.
And have never seen Breaking Bad. So we're into probably the sixth series
Okay.
or at least a sixth session of Breaking Bad. So enjoying that one as well. But
Yeah.
yeah, definitely like the series. And so, yeah.
Yeah, and I kind of like to know, like, before I die, like, there was a few, like, The Sopranos, and I think even I'm trying to think of if I watched Breaking Bad. I was late to the game, but I like the fact knowing that I've got 6 or 8 seasons ahead of you, because, like, what's disappointing, and I've done this a few times where I've started a series that I really like, and then you find out, or you're watching it as it's doing it, it's only got 1 season. What? This is crazy. I wish they'd keep going. And then there's a little disappointment there. So I like the long ones, and then the other one with Breaking Bad that I started and I stopped, but I know I got is Better Call Saul, which is the sort of the precursor to Breaking Bad, but
Okay.
it's told in such a weird non-chronological order that I don't even know where I left off. So I'm probably gonna have to start it again, which is be okay too. So, but it's good to have those. It's good to have those. So
Oh,
now, I know you spent a little bit of time before, but is home still London?
home is London, but all of my family and my husband's family are all Toronto and points east. So
Okay,
we're back and forth. We also
right.
have a small condo in Toronto, but our home is London and we spend lots of time on the 401 going back and forth. But yeah.
Okay, so London is a great
Mhm.
city. So I would love for you to give a recommendation to some lesser known place in that community that people say, hey, if you're going through on the 401 or you're stopping to London, you should check out. And it can be whatever you want: restaurant, cafe,
Oh.
park, museum, anything. What should they check out in the London area that's a little bit more of a hidden gem?
Well, I think London's called the Forest City, and it's for a reason. We have, I don't know how many, I think we have more trees than any other city in Canada. So it's a very green space. And just probably a kilometer from our home is Springbank Park. And it's a beautiful park along the Thames River in London, paved path. And it goes up to the university and all throughout the city. And I was very well used. And of course, during COVID, lots of people out
Mhm.
walking, biking, whether or not they're rollerblading. So highly recommend a visit to Springbank Park. It's a
All right.
gem.
Well, I like that. I hope I can get back to London. I will put that because that's always a thing for me when I'm in a new community is like, where's a good place to go for a walk? Like I like, and sometimes the app fails me. So it's better to hear it from a local to say like, no, this is where you want to go. So Springbank Park is on my list. Well, Laura, this has been a delight and just so grateful to reconnect and get to know you. We've been chatting over some other things in the last few months, which has been good. And I hope we can kind of stay connected. And I want to congratulate you on an amazing career and a continued contributions to education. I think people are all very pleased to have you serving Ontario and Ontario educators. So thank you.
Thank you very much for the opportunity. It was great chatting with you this afternoon and look forward to continued work together and learning from you as well.
Absolutely. Cheers.
Thank you.